If you resist, I will use force. The racist police officer's hand was shaking on his weapon as he shouted these words. 43 people stood frozen on that street corner, phones recording what they thought would be yet another tragedy. But in the next 600 seconds, something happened that made even the most hardened police officers break down crying. A single choice, made in the heat of that moment, would go on to save 47 lives, including the officer who was about to make the biggest mistake of his career. This video contains a moment so powerful that when it hit social media, it didn't just go viral, it sparked a movement. Police departments across the country now use it in their training. But here's what most people don't know. The calm black man facing down that officer's gun. He wasn't just a Navy SEAL with 12 years of combat experience. He was about to use a psychological technique so effective, so life-changing, that the officer who tried to arrest him now travels the country teaching it to others. Let me take you back to where it all started. It was 6:47 p.m. on a warm evening in downtown Arlington. Officer James Davidson had done this kind of stop hundreds of times before, but this time, he picked the wrong target. And the next 8 minutes would not only destroy everything he thought he knew about power, they would make him question every arrest he'd made in his 15-year career. Officer Davidson sat in his patrol car, his fingers drumming against the steering wheel as he watched the streets through narrowed eyes. 15 years on the force had left him hardened, cynical. Every shadow held a threat, every stranger a potential criminal. At least, that's what he told himself to justify what he was about to do. His radio crackled with routine chatter, but his attention was fixed on a man walking down the sidewalk. Marcus Reed moved with quiet confidence, dressed in a simple gray t-shirt and well-fitted jeans. A leather messenger bag hung from his shoulder, its contents unknown. To most observers, he was just another citizen going about his evening. But to Davidson, he was a target. Davidson's dashboard camera recorded the time, 6:47 p.m. The sun was just beginning to set, casting long shadows across the bustling street. He watched as Reed stopped at a crosswalk, waiting patiently for the light to change. Something about Reed's composure irritated Davidson. It wasn't fear or nervousness he saw, emotions he was used to people displaying when they spotted his patrol car. Instead, Reed carried himself with a self-assured dignity that Davidson found suspicious. "Let's see what you're really up to," Davidson muttered, putting his car in drive. His heart rate quickened slightly, the familiar surge of adrenaline he got when preparing to assert his authority. The light turned green, and Reed began crossing the street. Davidson pulled his patrol car forward, tires screeching slightly as he deliberately cut across Reed's path. The sudden movement caught the attention of nearby pedestrians. A young woman stopped mid-conversation, her phone half raised to her ear. A businessman carrying a briefcase slowed his hurried pace. In the growing crowd, phones began to emerge from pockets and purses, their cameras quietly recording what was about to unfold. Davidson stepped out of his car, adjusting his belt with practiced authority. "Hey you!" he barked, his voice sharp enough to make several bystanders flinch. But Reed didn't flinch. He turned slowly, his expression calm and unreadable. "Is there a problem, officer?" Reed's voice was steady, controlled. It wasn't the response Davidson was expecting, and it threw him off balance for a moment, but he quickly recovered, squaring his shoulders and advancing toward Reed. "You seem to be in quite a hurry," Davidson said, his tone dripping with unwarranted suspicion. "Mind telling me where you're headed?" The question hung in the air, sharp and accusatory. More people were stopping now, forming a loose circle around the confrontation. The soft clicks of phone cameras provided a quiet backdrop to the tension. Reed's response was measured, almost gentle. "I'm heading to the bookstore, officer. Is there a reason you've stopped me?" Davidson's jaw tightened. The calm response only served to fuel his growing irritation. "That bag," he said, pointing to Reed's messenger bag. "What's in it? You carrying anything I should know about?" A murmur rippled through the growing crowd. Someone whispered, "Here we go again." Davidson heard it, but chose to ignore it, focusing instead on Reed's face, searching for any sign of fear or guilt. But there was none. Reed's expression remained unchanged as he replied, "Would you like to check, officer?" The question wasn't delivered with defiance or sarcasm. Instead, it carried a quiet confidence that seemed to unsettle Davidson even more. "Drop the bag," Davidson commanded, his hand moving to rest on his utility belt. Slowly. Reed complied, carefully removing the messenger bag from his shoulder. But as he held it out, something in his eyes made Davidson pause. It wasn't fear he saw there, it was something else entirely. A look that seemed to say, "You're making a mistake you can't take back." The crowd had grown larger now, phones raised high, capturing every moment. The air was thick with tension as Davidson reached for the bag, his fingers trembling slightly, though he tried to hide it. He was about to discover that this routine stop was anything but routine, and his life was about to change in ways he never could have imagined. Davidson unzipped the messenger bag with deliberate slowness, his movements exaggerated for the growing audience. The setting sun cast long shadows across the scene, and the crowd's quiet murmurs created an electric atmosphere. Inside the bag, he found something that made him freeze. A book lay on top, its cover gleaming in the evening light. Leadership Under Pressure, a Navy SEAL's Guide to Excellence, was emblazoned across the front. Davidson's hand trembled slightly as he pulled it out, and his eyes widened when he saw the author's name. "Something wrong, officer?" Reed asked, his voice carrying a hint of something Davidson couldn't quite identify. It wasn't mockery, but there was a quiet strength in those words that made Davidson's stomach tighten. "You're saying this is your book?" Davidson demanded, trying to mask his growing unease with aggression. "You expect me to believe that?" Reed smiled slightly, reaching into his back pocket with deliberate slowness. Davidson's hand instinctively moved toward his weapon, but Reed was simply pulling out his military ID. "Lieutenant Marcus Reed, U.S. Navy SEALs," he said, holding out the card. "And yes, that's my book. Would you like me to autograph it for you?" A ripple of laughter ran through the crowd, followed by whispers of Navy SEAL and author. Davidson felt his face grow hot as he stared at the ID, the reality of his situation beginning to sink in. But pride and years of unchecked behavior made him double down instead of backing off. "This doesn't change anything," Davidson snapped, tossing the ID back to Reed. "Stand against the wall. Now!" Reed's expression shifted almost imperceptibly. "Officer Davidson," he said, reading the nameplate on Davidson's uniform, "I want you to think very carefully about what you're doing right now. Look around you." Davidson did look, and what he saw made his blood run cold. Dozens of phones were pointed at him, recording every word, every gesture. A local news van had just pulled up, its reporter already making her way through the crowd. But it was the faces that struck him hardest, faces filled with disappointment, anger, and a determination he'd never seen before. "You're interfering with a police investigation," Davidson said, but his voice lacked its earlier authority. The words sounded hollow even to his own ears. Reed took a step forward, his presence suddenly filling the space between them. "No, Officer Davidson, I'm standing up to abuse of power. There's a difference." His voice was calm, but carried a weight that seemed to press down on Davidson's shoulders. "You stopped me because of how I look. You assumed I was a threat because of the color of my skin, and now you're trying to justify it because you can't admit you were wrong." The crowd had fallen silent, hanging on every word. Someone in the back called out, "Tell him, Marcus!" Others joined in, their voices growing stronger, more unified. Davidson felt sweat beating on his forehead. This wasn't how these stops usually went. His targets usually cowered, apologized, or got angry. Reactions he knew how to handle. But Reed's calm confidence was dismantling his authority piece by piece, and he didn't know how to stop it. "You don't understand," Davidson began, but Reed cut him off. "I understand perfectly," Reed said, taking another step forward. "I understand that you've probably done this dozens of times before. I understand that you've gotten away with it because people were too afraid or too powerless to stand up to you. But today is different." Reed gestured to the crowd, to the phones recording every moment. "Today, you're going to learn something about real authority, the kind that comes from character, not from a badge." Davidson's hand trembled as he reached for his radio, but before he could call for backup, a new voice cut through the tension. "Officer Davidson!" The crowd parted to reveal Captain Sarah Martinez, Davidson's commanding officer, her face set in a grim expression as she surveyed the scene. "I've been watching the live stream from the station," Martinez said, her voice tight with controlled anger. "Stand down, now." Davidson felt the last vestiges of his authority crumbling, but as he started to lower his hand from his radio, Reed spoke again, his words carrying a weight that would haunt Davidson for years to come. "You have a choice to make right now, Officer Davidson," Reed said softly, but loud enough for everyone to hear. "This moment could be the end of your career, or it could be the beginning of your redemption. The question is, are you brave enough to admit you were wrong?" The crowd held its breath, waiting for Davidson's response. The sun had nearly set now, and the streetlights were flickering to life, casting harsh shadows across the scene. In that moment, with all eyes on him, Officer James Davidson faced the hardest decision of his 15-year career. Time seemed to stand still as Officer Davidson looked around at the sea of faces surrounding him. The weight of 15 years of decisions pressed down on his shoulders, and for the first time, he saw his actions through their eyes. The realization hit him like a physical blow. His hands began to shake as he took a step back, his voice barely above a whisper. I've been doing this all wrong, haven't I?" The crowd fell silent, surprised by the sudden vulnerability in his voice. Marcus Reed's expression softened slightly, but his stance remained firm. "Recognition is the first step," he said. "But what matters now is what you do next." Captain Martinez moved closer, her face a mixture of disappointment and determination. "Officer Davidson," she said, her voice carrying across the hushed crowd, "I need your badge and gun. You're suspended pending a full investigation." Davidson's hand moved to his badge, fingers tracing the metal that had defined his identity for so long. But before he could remove it, Marcus Reed spoke again. "Wait," Reed said, surprising everyone. He turned to address Captain Martinez. "Maybe there's a better way. Sometimes the hardest lessons become our greatest teachers." The crowd murmured as Reed continued, "Officer Davidson has a choice to make. He can fight this, deny everything, and probably lose his job. Or," Reed paused, making eye contact with Davidson, "he can become part of the solution." Davidson looked up, confusion clear on his face. "What do you mean?" "I teach a course," Reed explained, "not just about leadership, but about understanding our biases, about breaking down the walls we build between us. Maybe instead of ending your career, this could be the moment that transforms it." Captain Martinez considered this for a moment. "Are you suggesting rehabilitation instead of punishment?" "I'm suggesting accountability and growth," Reed replied. He turned back to Davidson. "But it has to be your choice. Are you willing to confront your biases, to learn, to change, not just for yourself, but for every person you'll interact with for the rest of your career?" Davidson's face showed a complex mix of emotions as he looked around at the crowd. He saw young faces, old faces, faces of every color, all waiting for his response. His gaze landed on a young black boy near the front, maybe 12 years old, watching him intently. In that moment, something broke inside Davidson, not his spirit, but the walls he'd built around his heart. "I'll do it," he said, his voice stronger now. "I want to be better. I need to be better." The tension in the air shifted, not disappearing entirely, but transforming into something else. A cautious hope. Reed nodded slowly. "It won't be easy," he warned. "You'll have to face uncomfortable truths about yourself. You'll have to unlearn habits that have been years in the making. Are you ready for that?" "I am," Davidson replied, and for the first time that evening, his voice carried no trace of authority or aggression, only honesty. Captain Martinez stepped forward. "You'll still face consequences," she said firmly. "There will be an investigation, and you'll be on administrative duty. But if you're serious about this, about really changing, the department will support your rehabilitation." The crowd watched in silence as Davidson finally removed his badge, handling it with new understanding of its weight, not just its physical weight, but the responsibility it represented. 6 months later, Davidson stood at a podium in the police academy, addressing a new class of recruits. The same young boy from the crowd sat in the audience with his mother, invited by Davidson himself. "I thought the badge gave me authority," Davidson told them, his voice carrying the wisdom of hard-learned lessons. "But true authority comes from respect, understanding, and service. It took losing my badge to truly understand what it means to wear one." Marcus Reed sat in the back of the room, watching with quiet satisfaction. The video of their confrontation had indeed gone viral, but not just as another example of police misconduct. Instead, it had become a powerful story of transformation and hope. Davidson continued, his words reaching beyond the recruits to the thousands who would later watch this moment online. "Every day, I have to choose who I want to be. Every interaction is a chance to show that change is possible. It's not enough to just wear the badge. We have to be worthy of it. The young boy who had watched the confrontation 6 months earlier raised his hand. "Officer Davidson?" he asked. "Do you regret what happened that day?" Davidson smiled, looking at Reed before answering. "I regret my actions that day, but I don't regret that it happened. Sometimes our worst moments can lead to our greatest growth, if we're brave enough to learn from them." As the room erupted in applause, Reed stood up. "Change is possible," he said, walking to join Davidson at the podium. "But it takes courage to admit our mistakes, wisdom to learn from them, and strength to become better because of them." The two men stood together, a living testament to the power of accountability, growth, and redemption. Their story would continue to inspire others, proving that even in our darkest moments, there's always a path to light, if we're brave enough to take it. If you found value in this story, don't forget to like and subscribe. Share your thoughts in the comments below. Have you ever witnessed a moment of transformation like this? How do you think we can promote positive change in our communities? Your voice matters in this conversation.